I want to tell you something that I have never said at the beginning of an episode before. I want to tell you that of all the stories we have covered on the HOA files, of all the foreclosure threats, and the forged elections, and the burned grills, and the cranes, and the rocks through windows, and the welcome mat violations, and the revenue optimization schemes, and the fabricated amendments, and the Fair Housing Act violations, and every other form of HOA madness that has crossed my desk in the course of doing this work. This is the story that made my production team stop working and just read. We have a rule in this office. When someone receives a new case summary, they read it alone and they come back to the group and they say either routine, interesting, or stop everything. In 4 years of doing this work, stop everything has happened exactly twice. This is the second time. The first was a foreclosure case. This one is about a skeleton. Let me be specific about what kind of skeleton we're talking about. Not a metaphorical skeleton. Not a skeleton in a closet in the sense of a hidden secret. A full-size plastic Halloween decoration skeleton. The kind you buy at a Halloween store or a party supply warehouse. Approximately 5 feet tall, with articulated joints that allow the arms and legs to be positioned in various poses. And let me be specific about what I mean by danced with. I mean that the HOA president of a planned community in Middle Tennessee took this skeleton outside at 2 o'clock in the morning and danced with it, in the middle of the street, in her nightgown, to music that was apparently audible to a substantial portion of the neighborhood. The whole street watched, and then the whole street found out that the woman who had been fining them for their lawn heights and their paint colors and their satellite dish angles and their holiday decoration timing had been doing things that not one of her 162 neighbors had been aware of, and that, once they became aware of them, produced the most complete and unanimous HOA governance reversal that the community's management company had ever documented. This is the story of Maple Creek Commons, Tennessee. This is the story of Francine. And this is the story of what happens when the person who has been holding a community's standards to impossible levels turns out to have been living by a completely different set of standards in the privacy of what she mistakenly believed was her own private life. Welcome to the HOA Files. Maple Creek Commons is a planned community of 162 homes in a suburb approximately 25 miles southeast of Nashville, Tennessee. It was developed 16 years ago during the period when the Nashville metropolitan area was expanding rapidly in every direction and suburban development was racing to accommodate the influx of people discovering that Tennessee had warm weather, no state income tax, a reasonable cost of living relative to the coasts, and a genuine cultural richness centered on Nashville that was attractive to a wide range of professional and creative people. The community sits on gently rolling Tennessee countryside that the developer preserved with reasonable sensitivity, keeping the mature hardwood trees that characterize the area and working with the natural topography rather than against it. The result is a neighborhood with a genuinely pleasant character, winding streets that follow the contours of the land, homes set at slight angles to each other, so that neighbors have privacy without complete separation, and the kind of established tree cover that 16 years of growth has provided, and that makes the community feel older and more settled than its actual age. The homes are comfortable family-sized properties, mostly 4-bedroom colonials and craftsman styles in the $450,000 to $580,000 range. The community has a modest pool, a clubhouse that can be rented for private events, a small playground, and a walking trail that loops around the community's Small Creek tributary, which is where the Maple Creek part of the name comes from. The HOA fees are $230 per month. The community attracts exactly the kind of residents that this price point and this setting attract in Middle Tennessee. Young professional families moving from Nashville proper in search of school districts and space. Empty nesters downsizing from larger properties in the region. A mixture of native Tennesseans and transplants from various parts of the country who have arrived in the Nashville area for careers in the music industry, healthcare, automotive manufacturing, and the various industries that have grown around these anchors. Our main character, whose name is Tyler, had been in Maple Creek Commons for 3 years at the time this story takes place. He was 36 years old, a graphic designer who worked primarily remotely for a design agency, which meant he spent a lot of time in and around his home and had developed a detailed familiarity with the rhythms of his neighborhood that his commuting neighbors had not. He was friendly without being intrusive, the kind of neighbor who knew your name and your dog's name, and would take your packages in from the porch if you were away, but who did not need to be in your business in any more extensive way than this. His wife Priya was 34, a data analyst who split her time between remote work and a Nashville office. Their son, Kai, was 7. Their daughter, Nadia, was 4. Tyler had a specific quality that is relevant to this story. He was a visual person, an observational person, a person who noticed things in his environment because his professional work required him to develop and maintain the habit of visual attention. He noticed when something changed in his neighborhood. He noticed details that his neighbors did not notice. He noticed, for instance, when a particular house on his street began showing patterns of activity in the middle of the night that were inconsistent with what a person who lived alone and had a demanding management role should have been doing at 2 in the morning. Francine had been in Maple Creek Commons for 10 years and on the HOA board for 6, serving as president for the last 4. She was 58 years old, a divorced woman who lived alone in a 5-bedroom colonial at the end of Tyler Street that was, by common consensus, the most aggressively maintained property in the entire community. Her lawn was always precisely cut. Her flower beds were always perfectly edged. Her holiday decorations were always displayed for exactly the permitted period and removed on the last permitted day. Her exterior paint was always within the approved palette and always in perfect condition. Her gutters were cleaned visibly and regularly. She was, in short, a person who lived at the extreme compliance end of the Maple Creek Commons community standard spectrum. And as its HOA board president, she enforced the community standards on her neighbors with the specific intensity of someone who genuinely lived by them herself. She was not, in the traditional HOA villain mold, a hypocrite in her external property presentation. She held her neighbors to the standards she met herself. She was demanding in a way that was at least internally consistent. What she was not, as Tyler began to understand through a series of nighttime observations that were initially entirely innocent and accidental, was living the kind of disciplined, organized life that her daytime presentation suggested. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. We need to start with the fence. Everything in HOA stories eventually starts with the fence. Actually, in this case, it started with a mailbox. Tyler's mailbox. Specifically, Tyler's mailbox post, which had been installed by the previous owner of his home and which had aged in the 16 years since the community was built in ways that mailbox posts age in Middle Tennessee, which is to say the wood had weathered and developed a slight lean, and the paint had faded to a tone that was several shades lighter than the approved Maple Creek Commons mailbox color, which was a specific shade of forest green that the community's governing documents described. With a paint code, Tyler had been aware of the mailbox situation since he moved in. He had been planning to replace the post since approximately his 2nd month of residence. He had simply been managing the priority stack of a remote worker with 2 young children who had recently moved into a new home, and the mailbox post had been sitting at approximately position 14 on a list of home maintenance tasks that never quite got shorter because new items kept appearing at the top. He received his first violation notice about the mailbox approximately 8 months after moving in. He acknowledged it, moved the mailbox post repair to position 3 on his list, and addressed it within the 30 days specified in the notice. He replaced the post with new wood, painted it the correct forest green, and sent a photo confirmation to the management company as the notice had requested. Fine. Done. No problem. 14 months later, he received a second violation notice about the mailbox post. This notice alleged that the mailbox post was not in compliance with the community's dimensional standards, specifically that it was 2 inches shorter than the required 36-inch minimum height. Tyler measured it. It was 36.5 inches. He provided a photograph with a tape measure clearly showing the measurement. The violation was withdrawn. 6 months after that, a third violation notice about the mailbox. This one alleged that the mounting bracket attaching the mailbox to the post was not the standard hardware specified in the community's homeowner guidelines. Tyler looked up the homeowner guidelines. The section on mailbox mounting hardware specified either the manufacturer-provided mounting system or a standard galvanized L bracket of at least 1/8 inch thickness. The bracket on his mailbox was a standard galvanized L bracket of approximately 3/16-inch thickness, exceeding the minimum specification. He documented this and responded in writing. The violation was withdrawn, but Tyler was noticing something. He had been in the community for 2 years and 3 months at this point and had received 3 violation notices, all about his mailbox, all lacking merit on the specific ground cited. He mentioned this to his neighbor across the street, a man named Greg who had been in the community for 7 years. Greg listened with the patient expression of someone who has heard this story before. He said that Tyler should consider himself lucky. He said that he himself had received 4 violation notices in the last year, 2 about his lawn, 1 about his fence, and 1 about a wind chime that was apparently visible from the street. He said the lawn notices had been during the same drought summer when the community's own irrigation system had been partially offline, meaning Greg's lawn had died in the same way that lawns across the community had died, but that only a handful of homeowners had received notices. Greg had been one of them. Tyler asked Greg which homeowners had not received notices during the drought summer. Greg said the ones Francine liked. Tyler said, "How do you know that?" Greg said everybody who had been here more than 4 years knew that. That Francine ran the HOA the way a club owner runs a club. If you were on her list, you were in. If you were not on her list, the rules applied at their maximum interpretation. Tyler went home and thought about this for a while. He was a graphic designer with a visual storytelling brain. He started thinking about the violation notices he had received as data points rather than isolated incidents. He started thinking about what the pattern looked like if you drew it out. He started paying attention to the community around him in a new way. He also, around the same time, started noticing the lights in Francine's house at unusual hours. Tyler's home office was in the front bedroom that he and Priya had converted for the purpose when they moved in. The window of this home office looked out onto the street, and from this window, he had a clear view of the cul-de-sac at the end of the street and of Francine's 5-bedroom colonial at its head. The view was not close enough to be intrusive. They were 3 houses apart, but it was close enough that lighting changes in Francine's house were visible from his desk, particularly at night when the contrast between lit windows and dark ones was significant. He first noticed the unusual pattern about 18 months into his residence. Around the same time, the second mailbox violation arrived. He was working late on a deadline project, sitting at his desk at 1:30 in the morning, when he noticed that lights in Francine's house were on. Several windows lit, which was unusual for a single person living alone at 1:30 on a weeknight. He noted it absently and went back to his work. 3 weeks later, working late again, he noticed the same thing. Lights in Francine's house at approximately 1:45 in the morning. He checked his watch, made a mental note, and moved on. A month after that, he was up at 2:15 with Nadia, who had been having a period of nighttime waking, and he happened to look out the window while carrying her back to her room and noticed not only that Francine's lights were on, but that music was audible from the direction of her house. Not loud music. The kind of music that is audible in the quiet of 2 in the morning in a suburban neighborhood when there is no competing ambient sound. He put Nadia back to bed. He stood at the hallway window for a few minutes listening. The music continued for approximately 20 more minutes, then stopped. The lights in Francine's house went dark shortly after. He told Priya about it in the morning. Priya said that was odd, but that people had insomnia for all kinds of reasons and that it was probably nothing. Tyler agreed and let it go. But the visual storyteller's brain filed it and kept adding to the file over the following months. The lights at unusual hours happened with a regularity that was inconsistent with simple insomnia. Insomnia is irregular. It appears on nights when sleep is difficult and is absent on nights when sleep comes easily. What Tyler was observing in Francine's house was not irregular. It was occurring on roughly the same nights each week, at roughly the same hours, and with a consistent pattern of increased activity that was not what insomnia looked like. Over approximately 4 months, Tyler built a log. Not a formal documentation file. He was not yet thinking in legal terms. Just a note-keeping habit that his visual and organized brain had developed. Dates and approximate times when he observed lights in Francine's house at unusual hours. Dates and approximate times when music was audible. The pattern that emerged from his log was consistent. It happened primarily on Friday and Saturday nights. It started around 1 in the morning and ran until approximately 3 or 3:30. And it was consistent enough to be a routine rather than an aberration. What was happening in Francine's house on Friday and Saturday nights between 1 and 3:30 in the morning? Tyler had a hypothesis, but he had no way to confirm it from his home office window 3 houses down a cul-de-sac in the dark. The lights told him activity was happening. The music told him the activity involved sound. Neither told him what the activity was. The skeleton told him everything. It was a Friday night in late October, 3 weeks before Halloween, approximately 28 months after Tyler had moved into Maple Creek Commons. Tyler had been working late on a project with a Monday deadline. Priya was asleep. The kids were asleep. It was one of those quiet nights when the house felt particularly still and the neighborhood outside the home office window felt particularly dark. At approximately 2:03 in the morning, Tyler looked up from his screen and noticed that the lights in Francine's house were on, which was consistent with his log's Friday pattern and which he noted without particular interest. He was accustomed to this by now. He went back to his work. At 2:11 in the morning, he heard music, again consistent with the pattern. He noted it. He went back to his work. At 2:17 in the morning, Francine's front door opened. Tyler looked up because the movement caught his peripheral vision. Francine's porch light came on, which it had not done during the previous instances of late-night activity that he had observed. The front door was fully open, and Francine emerged. She was wearing a nightgown, a long white nightgown of the kind that is sold as vintage style or Victorian style, floor length, with long sleeves, the kind of garment that is dramatic in appearance even in normal circumstances. She was barefoot. Her hair, which she always wore in a precise short style during the day, was down and somewhat disheveled. She was carrying the skeleton, a full-size plastic Halloween decoration skeleton, approximately 5 feet tall, the joints positioned so that its arms were extended in a dancing pose. She carried it out on her front porch and then down the porch steps to the driveway and then out to the street. In the street, in the light of the street lamp at the head of the cul-de-sac, she positioned the skeleton at arm's length from herself and began to dance with it. Tyler stared. He was not immediately sure what he was seeing. His brain ran through several alternative explanations in rapid succession. Sleepwalking, some kind of medical episode, a Halloween prank he was not understanding the context of. He considered each of these and discarded each of them because none of them fully fit what he was observing. She was moving deliberately and rhythmically to the music, which was now clearly audible, a slow song, something with strings. She was holding the skeleton's extended arm with one hand and had her other hand at its waist. She was waltzing with a skeleton in the middle of her suburban street at 2:17 in the morning. Tyler's first instinct was to wake Priya. His second instinct was that he should document this before he did anything else. He picked up his phone. He opened the camera. He hesitated for a moment because photographing a neighbor's nighttime behavior felt like a significant step. Then he remembered 3 years of mailbox violations and Greg's account of the drought summer and the pattern in his log, and he photographed. He took 8 photographs from the home office window. Then he took a video. The video was 47 seconds long and captured Francine dancing with the skeleton in the street clearly and completely. He texted Priya. He said she needed to see something. He said it was important, and it was also extremely strange. Priya came to the home office. She looked at the video. She watched it twice. Then she looked at Tyler with an expression that he described to me as the most profoundly confused face he had ever seen on another person. She said, "Is that Francine?" He said yes. She said, "Is she dancing with a skeleton?" He said yes. She said, "In the street?" He said yes. She said, "What is happening?" He said he did not know, but he thought they were about to find out. Because at this moment, 2 other things were happening simultaneously that Tyler could see from his window. The front porch light of the house, directly adjacent to Francine's, had come on. Then the front door of that house opened, and a neighbor appeared in the doorway, clearly woken by the music. And from the direction of the far end of the street, the porch light of another house came on. Then another. The music was louder than Tyler had realized. The music was loud enough to wake the neighbors. The whole street was about to watch. Over the next 22 minutes, which is the duration of the street incident that Tyler's video documentation and the accounts of multiple witnesses later established, the following things happened in sequence. Francine danced with the skeleton. The dancing was continuous and appeared to be genuinely engaged, not performative or self-conscious. She was immersed in it. She was not doing it for an audience. She was doing it because she was doing it with the complete absorption of someone who was not aware of being observed or had stopped caring about being observed somewhere in the preceding several hours. Lights came on in 8 homes along Tyler Street as the music woke sleeping residents. 5 front doors opened. 7 residents emerged to varying degrees from their homes, ranging from standing fully on the porch to standing an open front door. 2 residents Tyler saw through his window had their phones out and appeared to be taking photographs or video. This was all happening in Francine's full view. If she had looked up from her dancing partner at any point, she would have seen her lit and open-door neighborhood watching her. But she did not look up. She continued dancing. At some point, approximately 12 minutes into the street portion of the event, a car turned onto the street. It was someone returning home, a young couple who lived in the first house on the street. Their headlights swept across Francine as they turned. Francine looked up. She was caught in the headlights of their car for a full 3 seconds, holding the skeleton, standing in the middle of the street in her white nightgown. The car stopped. There was a moment. A very still, very specific moment in which Francine was illuminated in car headlights in the middle of her street, holding a dancing skeleton while 8 lit houses and at least 7 visible neighbors looked on. Then Francine looked at the houses. She looked at the lit windows. She looked at the people on porches. She looked at the car, stopped in the street with its headlights on her. She held the skeleton for another moment. Then she walked back to her porch, up the porch steps, and into her house. The front door closed. The porch light went off. The music stopped approximately 90 seconds later. Tyler's video captured the full 22 minutes. He saved it in 3 places before he went back to bed. He lay awake for approximately an hour after returning to bed, not out of excitement, but out of a specific kind of thoughtful calculation that his project manager brain was running. He was thinking about what he had seen and what it meant and what, if anything, should happen next. He was not thinking about it maliciously. He was thinking about it as a piece of information that had arrived in a context that was already full of other pieces of information, and he was thinking about whether and how all of these pieces connected. He fell asleep around 3:30. In the morning, over coffee, he told Priya what he had been thinking about. She listened. Then she said something that Tyler told me was the most important thing said in the early stage of what was about to become a significant community situation. She said that what they had seen was strange, but that strangeness was not a legal claim. She said that if Tyler wanted to use what he had seen in any way that was going to affect Francine's position as HOA president, he was going to need to understand why it was relevant beyond just being unusual. She said there needed to be a connection between Francine's private behavior and the governance conduct that had been targeting their family. Otherwise, Tyler was just a neighbor who had filmed another neighbor doing something odd and was using it against her, which was neither right nor what Tyler actually wanted to do. Tyler said she was right. He said he agreed. He said the question was what the connection was. He went to his home office and opened his log. Tyler's log of unusual nighttime activity at Francine's house was 14 months old by the time of the skeleton incident. When he reviewed it the morning after, he found that it documented 53 separate instances of unusual late-night activity, clustered primarily on Friday and Saturday nights, running between approximately 1 and 3:30 in the morning. He sat with this data for a while. Then he did something that the graphic designer in him was well-equipped to do. He visualized the data. He mapped it. He laid out the 53 instances on a calendar grid, and then laid the violation notices he had received over the same period on the same grid. The overlay was striking in a specific way. The violation notices he had received had been issued on business days following weekends that included instances of late-night activity at Francine's house. The correlation was not absolute. Some weekends with late-night activity had not produced violation notices, but the reverse correlation was close to absolute. Nearly every violation notice he had received had been issued after a weekend that included a late-night activity instance. The same pattern held for the violation notices that Greg had described and for the accounts of several other neighbors that Tyler now began to seek out and document. This was interesting, but it was still correlation rather than causation. Tyler did not know what was causing the late-night activity. He did not know what the activity was. He had a 47-second video of a woman dancing with a skeleton and 14 months of logged observations, but he did not know what they meant. He called a friend named Stephanie, who was a nurse practitioner at a Nashville hospital. He described what he had been observing without naming Francine and asked Stephanie if a pattern of unusual late-night activity that was regular rather than random on specific nights of the week, accompanied by music and what appeared to be energetic behavior, could indicate anything medically or behaviorally specific. Stephanie said yes. She said that pattern of behavior, regular rather than random, specific nights, late-night energy rather than daytime tiredness, could be consistent with a number of things including certain medication interactions, certain sleep disorders, and certain substance use patterns. She said she was not diagnosing anyone and that without clinical evaluation, she could not say anything specific, but that what Tyler was describing sounded like a pattern rather than random insomnia. Tyler thanked her. He did not pursue the medical angle. It was not his place. What Stephanie had told him confirmed that the pattern was a pattern, which he already knew, but it did not tell him what to do with the pattern. He called his neighbor Greg. He told Greg about the skeleton incident. Greg was quiet for a long moment. Then Greg said he had actually been woken by the music the previous Friday night, but had not looked out his window to see what was happening and had not known about the skeleton until Tyler told him. Tyler asked Greg a specific question. He asked whether Greg had ever received a violation notice for something that he later discovered other homeowners in identical or comparable situations had not received notices for. Greg said yes. Specifically, the wind chime violation. He said he had noticed after receiving the notice that at least 3 other properties in the community had wind chimes visible from the street, and none of them had received notices. He said all 3 of those properties were owned by people who had been in the community for a long time and who had social relationships with Francine. Tyler documented this conversation. He was beginning to see the shape of something, not yet fully formed, but taking form. He needed one more thing before he could understand what the connection was between Francine's nighttime behavior and her HOA governance conduct. He needed to understand what was actually happening on those Friday and Saturday nights. The answer came from a completely unexpected direction. Melissa had lived in Maple Creek Commons for 9 years. She was 44 years old, a realtor, the kind of person who knew everyone in the community and who had the specific social intelligence that comes from a career spent reading people and understanding the dynamics of communities and neighborhoods. She was also, it emerged, the person who knew exactly what was happening at Francine's house on Friday and Saturday nights. Tyler had been building his informal coalition of concerned homeowners for about 3 weeks following the skeleton incident when Melissa appeared on his front porch on a Sunday afternoon with a bottle of wine and an expression that said she had information. She had heard from Greg that Tyler was asking questions about enforcement patterns and about Francine. She said she had information that was relevant and that she had been sitting on for approximately a year because she had not known what to do with it and had not known how it was relevant to anything except as a personal observation about a neighbor. She said she knew what happened at Francine's house on Friday and Saturday nights. Tyler invited her in. Priya made coffee to go with the wine. Melissa told them that approximately 1 year before, she had been returning home late on a Saturday night from a client dinner in Nashville. It was around midnight. As she pulled into her driveway, she had noticed 2 cars parked outside Francine's house that she did not recognize. This was unusual enough that she noted it, but she thought nothing more of it. 2 weeks later, she had been out early on a Sunday morning walking her dog when she noticed a woman she did not recognize leaving Francine's house at approximately 7 in the morning. This was even more unusual. Single people who lived alone did not typically have unknown visitors leaving at 7 on Sunday morning, but again she noted it and thought nothing specific. The third observation had been the one that provided the full picture. Approximately 8 months before Tyler's skeleton incident, Melissa had been awake at 2 in the morning because of a work concern, sitting in her living room with the front window slightly open for the night air, when she heard music coming from Francine's house, and then heard voices and laughter. Multiple voices. A social gathering. Melissa was a realtor. She was a person who understood the value of knowing things about a community and who had the social connections to find things out. She had spent the next few weeks quietly and carefully gathering information through her community network. What she found was this. Francine was hosting regular private gatherings at her home on Friday and Saturday nights. The gatherings were small, between 5 and 12 people, beginning around 10 or 11 in the evening and running until the early morning hours. They involved music and were, by the accounts of the few people who knew about them and whom Melissa had spoken with carefully, genuinely festive occasions that were nothing illegal and nothing extraordinary except for the specific fact that they were occurring in the home of the HOA president of a community where music after 10 in the evening was a technical violation of the community's noise standards. Francine was regularly violating the community's noise standards in her own home. The same noise standards that she had cited in 2 violation notices against a homeowner on the far side of the community who had received complaints about a wind chime audible from the adjacent property. Tyler looked at Melissa. Melissa looked at Tyler. Tyler said that explained the skeleton. Melissa said it explained more than that. She said that she had spoken to 3 of the people who attended Francine's gatherings. She was not going to identify them because they were community members who had not done anything wrong and who had legitimate reasons for wanting to remain private. But she could tell Tyler something about who they were. They were long-term Maple Creek Commons residents. Every one of them. The people at Francine's gatherings were the people who were on her list. The ones who did not get violation notices during drought summers. The ones whose wind chimes were not cited. The ones whose mailbox posts were not measured. The HOA president of Maple Creek Commons was running a social club out of her home in violation of the community's noise standards, and the members of the club were the homeowners who received preferential HOA enforcement treatment. The connection that Priya had told Tyler he needed to find was right there. Tyler was a graphic designer, not an attorney. But he was about to become very familiar with the work of attorneys because what he had assembled needed professional guidance to be used correctly. He called a friend of a friend who was recommended as an HOA attorney with Tennessee practice, a woman named Patricia who had been doing HOA law in the Nashville area for 22 years. He described the situation to Patricia in a detailed, organized briefing that Patricia later told me was among the most clearly presented initial client presentations she had received from a non-attorney. She said Tyler had the specific quality that graphic designers sometimes have of being able to present complex information in a clear and logical sequence that allowed the listener to understand the full picture without having to ask clarifying questions. Patricia's assessment of the legal situation was multidimensional. First, the selective enforcement claim. The pattern of violation notices that Tyler had documented, supported by the accounts of Greg and other neighbors and by the enforcement data that Patricia would request from the management company, described a textbook selective enforcement situation. Rules being applied to some homeowners and not to others based on their social relationship with the board president rather than their actual compliance status. In Tennessee, as in most states, this kind of discriminatory enforcement of HOA rules was a violation of both the HOA's own governing documents, which required rules to be applied consistently and without favoritism, and of the state's HOA governance statute. Second, the noise violation documentation. If Francine was regularly hosting gatherings that violated the community's noise standards, and this could be documented with the same rigor that Tyler had been applying to his observation log, then the HOA president was herself in ongoing violation of the same standards she was enforcing against others. This was not just ironic. It was legally relevant as evidence of the selective enforcement pattern. It showed that Francine had firsthand knowledge that the noise standards were being violated in her home on a regular basis, and had chosen not to enforce them against herself while enforcing related standards against neighbors who were not in her social circle. Third, the governance misconduct claim. A board president who used her position to reward social allies with preferential enforcement treatment while burdening non-allied homeowners with aggressive enforcement was engaging in conduct that violated her fiduciary duty to the community as a whole. This was potentially actionable against both Francine personally and against the HOA as an organization for allowing this conduct to continue. Patricia said she needed 3 things to build the case properly. The documentation Tyler had already assembled, organized, and produced. A formal records request for the complete violation notice history of Maple Creek Commons for the preceding 4 years. And a way to document the noise violations at Francine's home that was collected through legitimate means and that could be used in legal proceedings. Tyler had the first. Patricia filed the second. The third was going to require some thought. Tyler proposed a solution that Patricia reviewed and approved. He was going to install a decibel measurement device and a sound recording system that captured ambient noise levels from the public street in front of his property during the hours when Francine's gatherings typically occurred. The measurements and recordings would establish documented evidence of noise levels from the direction of Francine's property during those hours. The device would be on his property, measuring sound levels in a public street-adjacent area. There was no privacy violation in recording ambient sound levels from a public street. The documentation would be legitimate and usable. Tyler purchased a professional-grade noise measurement device and installed it in the front window area of his home office, calibrated to record from the direction of the cul-de-sac. He set it to record continuously on Friday and Saturday nights between 11 in the evening and 4 in the morning. He also updated his log. He documented the skeleton incident with the video and photographs in his written account. He documented every subsequent nighttime observation with the same specificity. He documented the conversation with Melissa with her consent and with her agreement that she would provide a written statement if needed. He also did something else. He built the visual presentation of the enforcement pattern data in a format that he, as a graphic designer, could make genuinely compelling. He created a series of charts showing violation notice frequency over time, comparative notice rates between homeowners at different stages of their community tenure, the correlation between social relationship with Francine and enforcement action rates. He presented this data in the clean, clear, professionally designed format that his career had made natural to him. When Patricia saw the data visualization, she called it the best self-prepared client exhibit she had ever received. The case building took approximately 3 months. When Patricia had everything she needed, she called Tyler and told him they were ready to move. The management company's response to Patricia's formal records request produced the complete violation notice history for Maple Creek Commons for the preceding 4 years, organized by property, date, alleged violation, and outcome. The data set was extensive, covering 4 years of a 162-home community. Tyler spent a weekend analyzing it with Priya's help. Priya was a data analyst. She was better at this than Tyler, who was visual but not quantitative in the same way. Together, they built the analysis that Patricia needed. The numbers were remarkable. Homeowners who had lived in Maple Creek Commons for more than 5 years received violation notices at a rate of approximately 0.8 per year. Homeowners who had lived in the community for less than 5 years received violation notices at a rate of approximately 2.4 per year. The difference was statistically significant. But the more striking finding was not the tenure-based differential. It was the social relationship differential. When Priya identified the homeowners who appeared in Francine's social network, primarily through cross-referencing with a list of long-term residents who Melissa had confirmed attended the gatherings, and compared their violation notice rates against long-term residents who were not in Francine's social network, the differential was extreme. Francine's social network received an average of 0.3 violation notices per year. Long-term residents outside her network received an average of 1.9 per year. Newer residents outside her network received an average of 2.4 per year. The pattern was clear and documented and supported by 4 years of the HOA's own records. Patricia added the data analysis to the case file. She noted that the records also showed something that Tyler had not been looking for, but that turned out to be significant. The violation notices issued to Francine's social network members were primarily issued during the first year or two of their community residence, before they had established their social relationship with Francine. After the relationship was established, their violation notice rates dropped to near zero. This was the specific pattern of someone who used enforcement as a mechanism for evaluating and selecting community members, finding everyone until they passed some implicit test, and then stopping once they had proven themselves acceptable. Patricia also found, in the violation records, several notices issued to homeowners citing noise violations under the community's standards for noise after 10 in the evening. The most recent of these had been issued 3 months before Tyler had begun building his case. The recipient was a homeowner on the far side of the community who had received a formal notice citing music audible from the adjacent property after 10 p.m. The fine for this violation was $150. Patricia noted this specific entry. The irony was not lost on her. She filed it in the exhibit section of the case documentation with a specific label. Meanwhile, Tyler's noise measurement device was producing data. Over the 3 months of active recording, it documented 22 instances of elevated noise levels in the direction of Francine's home on Friday and Saturday nights between 11 p.m. and 3:30 a.m. The noise levels on 17 of these 22 instances exceeded the community's 10 p.m. noise standard. On 5 of the instances, the levels significantly exceeded the standard. The recordings captured music clearly identifiable as emanating from the direction of the cul-de-sac on multiple occasions. Patricia reviewed the documentation and made a formal determination that the case was ready. She sent the demand letter on a Tuesday morning. It was addressed to Francine personally, to the Maple Creek Commons HOA board, and to the management company. It was 22 pages long and described every element of the case in documented, precise detail. Patricia's demand letter laid out the legal situation with the organized completeness of 22 years of HOA law practice. It described the selective enforcement pattern with the 4-year statistical analysis and the social network correlation. It described the noise violation documentation from Tyler's recording device. It referenced the irony of the noise citation issued to another homeowner 3 months earlier, while Francine's own gatherings were generating equivalent and documented noise levels. It described the specific governance misconduct of using HOA enforcement as a social reward and punishment mechanism. It outlined the legal claims available to the affected homeowners, including claims under Tennessee's HOA statute, claims under the governing document's good faith and fair dealing provisions, and claims against Francine personally for breach of fiduciary duty. It demanded specific relief. Withdrawal of all improperly issued violation notices for homeowners identified in the selective enforcement analysis. Refunds of all fines collected on those notices. An independent audit of all enforcement actions during Francine's 4-year presidency. A formal community meeting at which the board would be required to report to all homeowners on the governance irregularities documented in the letter. Francine's resignation from the HOA board. Adoption of specific enforcement transparency measures, including a public violation notice log and mandatory CC&R citation requirements for all enforcement actions. And Patricia's legal fees. The letter also contained a section that Patricia had not included in previous HOA demand letters in her career because it had never before been relevant. She described the skeleton incident specifically and completely. She described what Tyler had documented on the night of October the 17th. She noted that the incident was documented by video. She noted that the noise levels associated with the gathering on that specific night had been recorded by the measurement device as significantly exceeding the community's 10 p.m. noise standard. She noted that the incident had been observed by multiple community residents who would be available to provide statements. She said that she included this information not for its entertainment value, but because it was directly relevant to the selective enforcement claim. It demonstrated that Francine had direct and repeated personal experience of the specific type of standard she was enforcing against others, that she had knowledge of her own noncompliance, and that she had chosen not to self-enforce while continuing to enforce aggressively against homeowners outside her social circle. She sent the letter certified mail to all 3 recipients simultaneously on a Tuesday morning at 9 a.m. She called Tyler at 9:30 to confirm the letter had been sent. Tyler asked how she expected it to be received. Patricia said that in 22 years of HOA law practice, demand letters fell into 3 categories. letters that were ignored because the other side calculated that the homeowner would not actually follow through with litigation, letters that were received with hostility and a counter-narrative that needed to be worked through, and letters that landed like a bomb because the recipient had not known the depth of the documentation against them and the depth of the legal exposure, and was confronted suddenly with both. She said this letter was the third kind. She was right. The first call came to Patricia from the management company's attorney 3 days after the letter was received. The management company had reviewed the letter and its exhibits with appropriate alarm. The management company's attorney said that his client was deeply concerned about the governance irregularities documented in the letter and that the management company had not been aware of the patterns described in the data analysis. He said the management company wished to cooperate fully with any investigation and took its own obligations under Tennessee HOA law seriously. Patricia noted that this was the management company attempting to separate itself from Francine's conduct as quickly as possible. This was useful because it meant the management company would not be opposing her demands. She acknowledged the management company's cooperative posture and said she would be in touch about the audit process. The second call came from the HOA board's attorney 4 days after the letter was received. The 4 non-Francine board members had retained independent counsel the previous day. Their attorney said the board had reviewed the letter and found its contents deeply concerning. He said the board was committed to taking appropriate governance action and asked about the process for doing so. Patricia outlined her demands specifically. The board's attorney said he would need to discuss several of the specific items with the board, but that the general direction of cooperation rather than opposition was clear. The third call came 1 week after the letter was received. It was from Francine's personal attorney. Francine's attorney was a Nashville litigator who opened the call with a specific aggressive posture that some defense attorneys default to when they have a difficult case. He challenged several elements of the documentation. He questioned the admissibility of certain evidence. He suggested that the selective enforcement claim was based on an overly simplistic statistical analysis that ignored legitimate distinguishing factors between properties. Patricia listened to all of this with the patience of someone who had prepared for exactly this response. She responded to each challenge specifically and thoroughly. She noted that the statistical analysis had been prepared by a credentialed data analyst who would serve as an expert witness if needed. She noted that the noise measurement device documentation had been reviewed by a sound engineer whose expert assessment confirmed the methodology. She noted that the video documentation was available and would be submitted as evidence. And then she mentioned the noise citation issued 3 months before Tyler's case had been built, the $150 fine issued to a homeowner on the far side of the community for music audible after 10 p.m., while Francine's own gatherings had been generating equivalent documented noise levels on 22 recorded occasions over the same period. Francine's attorney was quiet for a moment. Then he said he would need to discuss the situation with his client. He called back the following day. He said his client was prepared to discuss resolution. The negotiation took 6 weeks. Patricia handled it on behalf of Tyler and a growing group of Maple Creek Commons homeowners who had retained her for the matter as the news of the case had spread through the community. 14 homeowners ultimately joined the action, people who had received violation notices that the data analysis identified as inconsistent with the enforcement pattern applied to Francine's social circle. Patricia's negotiating position was clear and consistent. Every demand in the original letter was on the table. She was not moving significantly on any of them. The documentation was comprehensive, the legal exposure was significant, and the specific irony of the noise citation made the selective enforcement claim unusually well illustrated. She had no incentive to substantially reduce her demands. Francine's attorney tried several approaches. He argued that the statistical analysis was insufficient to support the claim. Patricia produced the data analyst's expert report. He argued that the noise measurements were ambiguous about source. Patricia produced the sound engineer's assessment. He argued that the skeleton video was irrelevant to any legal claim. Patricia agreed it was not itself a legal claim, but said it was admissible evidence of the pattern and that it would be presented as such in any proceeding. The most significant moment of the negotiation came in week 4, when Francine's attorney raised what he apparently believed was a compelling argument. He said that Francine's private social activities at her home were her personal business, and that any attempt to use them in a legal proceeding constituted an invasion of her privacy. Patricia said that she completely agreed that Francine's private social activities were private, and that she had no interest in publicizing them beyond the extent required for the legal proceedings. She also said that the argument cut both ways. She said that if Francine's gatherings were private matters that occurred in her own home, they were precisely the kind of private matter that her neighbors were also entitled to within their own homes, which was the entire basis of the selective enforcement claim. The neighbors who had received noise violation notices for music from their properties were entitled to the same private enjoyment of their homes that Francine was claiming for herself. She said, in other words, if Francine's musical gatherings were private and exempt from enforcement, so were her neighbors' wind chimes. There was a long pause on the phone. Then Francine's attorney said he would be in touch. The settlement was reached in week 6. Every demand from Patricia's letter was met. All improperly identified violation notices were withdrawn. All fines collected on those notices were refunded, totaling approximately $31,000 across 14 homeowners. An independent audit was commissioned. A community meeting was scheduled. Francine resigned from the HOA board. The enforcement transparency measures, including the public violation notice log and the mandatory CC&R citation requirements, were adopted into the community's governing documents. Francine's personal financial contribution to the refund amount and to Patricia's legal fees was substantial. Her attorney had negotiated a contribution structure that was not publicly disclosed, but that the management company's subsequent independent audit confirmed was appropriate to her individual share of the governance responsibility. The community meeting that the settlement required was held on a Thursday evening in the Maple Creek Commons Clubhouse. It was attended by 114 of the 162 households in the community, easily the largest gathering in the neighborhood's history. People have been told in the advance notice that the meeting was to address significant governance matters and that the board had important information to share. By the time the meeting occurred, enough of the story had circulated through the community that most attendees had a general sense of what was coming. But the complete picture was not yet public. The acting board president, a man named Robert who had been the treasurer and was now the senior remaining board member following Francine's resignation, and the resignation of one other member who had been closely aligned with Francine, opened the meeting with the specific, careful tone of someone managing a difficult truth-telling moment in a community context. He presented the findings, the selective enforcement pattern, the statistical analysis, the noise documentation, the refund amounts, the governance reforms that had been adopted. He was thorough and honest and did not minimize what had occurred. The community's response was varied. Some people were angry. Some were sad. Some were, Tyler told me, visibly processing the specific, complex emotion of discovering that someone they had trusted with governance authority over their homes and their money had been using that authority as a personal social tool. Several people were also, and I want to be honest about this because it was a real dimension of the community's response, simply amused by the skeleton. The skeleton had spread through the community by word of mouth in the weeks since the incident, and it had become a kind of shorthand for the entire situation. The HOA president who fined you for your wind chime had been dancing with a skeleton in the street at 2 in the morning. The juxtaposition was so complete and so perfect that even people who were genuinely angry about the enforcement pattern found themselves occasionally laughing at it. Tyler did not address the community at the meeting. He sat in the audience and watched the process work. He had said what he needed to say through his attorney and through the documentation. The meeting was for the community as a whole. At the end of the meeting, Robert announced the schedule for the special election to fill the vacant board positions. He also announced that the management company had been given specific new oversight requirements under the community's governing documents, including mandatory reporting of any homeowner complaint about enforcement inconsistency directly to the full board rather than through the president alone. After the meeting, Tyler was approached by a homeowner he had not met before a woman who had been in the community for 8 years and who told him that she had received a violation notice 3 years earlier for a wreath on her door that she had been told was not an approved decorative item under the community's exterior standards. She had paid the $100 fine. She had removed the wreath. She had never challenged the notice because she had not known she could, and because $100 seemed like a fight not worth fighting. She asked if her wreath was on the list of improperly assessed violations. It was. She would receive a refund of $100. She thanked Tyler. He told her the work was Patricia's and Priya's and Melissa's and the management company that had cooperated and the board members who had done the right thing when they had to. He said he had just been the person who kept the log. She said keeping the log was the thing that made everything else possible. He thought about that on the drive home. I've been thinking about the skeleton since I first heard this story, not the Halloween decoration itself, though the Halloween decoration is genuinely extraordinary as a narrative element. I've been thinking about what it represents and why it matters beyond its entertainment value. The skeleton is perfect as a symbol because of the specific double meaning that Halloween skeletons carry in American culture. A Halloween skeleton represents death in its most stripped-down form, the bones beneath the flesh, the structure beneath the surface. It is also, in its decorative Halloween form, a symbol of something that is meant to be frightening but is actually harmless, a costume, a performance of danger rather than danger itself. Francine had been performing something for 4 years. She had been performing the role of the rigorous, standards-enforcing HOA president whose own property was always in perfect compliance and whose enforcement decisions were always based on community standards rather than personal preference. The performance was elaborate and consistent. The lawn was always perfect. The gutters were always clean. The holiday decorations were always timed correctly. She had been performing compliance with the seriousness of someone whose entire authority derived from the performance. Behind the performance, she was hosting gatherings that violated the community's noise standards. She was using her enforcement authority to reward the people who attended those gatherings and to burden the people who did not. She was dancing in the street at 2 in the morning with a skeleton. The skeleton in the street was the moment when the bones showed through. When the structure beneath the performance became visible. When the person who had been telling the community how to live had her own way of living revealed in the most dramatically literal way possible, standing in a nightgown in the middle of the street under a street lamp, holding a dancing decoration, watched by her entire neighborhood. Tyler did not plan this revelation. Francine created it herself. She had been creating it for years through the pattern of her Friday and Saturday nights. She had just never been seen before. The 14 months of Tyler's log, the noise measurement device, the data analysis, the Patricia demand letter, all of this would have happened eventually with or without the skeleton. The selective enforcement pattern was documentable. The noise violations were documentable. The case existed independently of the specific image of Francine dancing in the street. But the skeleton accelerated everything. It accelerated it because it made the pattern human and visible in a way that statistical analysis cannot make things human and visible. It showed the community, in 47 seconds of video, the specific person who had been telling them to remove their wreaths and cut their grass and quieten their wind chimes, standing in the street in her nightgown, dancing with a plastic Halloween decoration to music audible from 8 houses, unconstrained by any of the standards she enforced on others. The skeleton was not the case, but it was the case made visible. This story has practical lessons embedded in it alongside the extraordinary narrative, and I want to draw them out clearly because they are applicable to a much broader audience than the specific residents of Maple Creek Commons, Tennessee. The first lesson is about the log. Tyler's log was the foundation of everything. He started keeping it not as a legal strategy, but as the natural expression of his visual and observational nature. He noticed something and he wrote it down. He noticed it again and he wrote it down again. Over 14 months, he had a documented pattern that became central to the case. Most people who observe patterns in their environment do not write them down because writing them down feels excessive, like you're making a bigger deal of something than it deserves to be. Tyler wrote them down anyway, consistently and specifically, and the specificity of his records was what gave the pattern legal weight. Document what you observe, not obsessively or invasively, just accurately and consistently. A dated entry in a notes file takes 30 seconds, and the cumulative value of 30 seconds repeated consistently over 14 months was the foundation of a successful legal case. The second lesson is about data analysis. Tyler had a data analyst for a spouse and the sense to ask for her help. Priya's contribution to this case was the quantitative analysis that turned Tyler's qualitative observations into objective documented evidence. The statistical pattern in the violation notice records, the comparative rates by tenure and social relationship, the correlation analysis, was the work of someone who understood data analysis professionally and who applied that understanding to HOA governance records that were, by Tennessee law, available to all homeowners. Know what professional skills exist in your household and in your community. The case that resolved Maple Creek Commons governance problems required a graphic designer, a data analyst, a nurse practitioner consult, a sound engineer, a realtor with community intelligence, and a 22-year HOA law veteran. None of these people were hired in advance. They were called when they were needed. Tyler knew who they were because he paid attention to the people in his life and the people in his community. The third lesson is about Melissa. Melissa knew things that Tyler needed to know, and she came to him when she understood her knowledge was relevant. She came because Tyler had been asking questions through the community in a way that was genuine and low pressure, talking to people, listening to their experiences, building a picture collaboratively rather than alone. If Tyler had been conducting his investigation privately, Melissa might never have connected her knowledge to his case. Build your coalition. Talk to your neighbors. Not to recruit them for a fight, but to understand the full picture of the community you live in. The full picture is always larger and more complex than any single homeowner's experience of it. The fourth lesson is about professional legal help at the right stage. Tyler did not call Patricia during his 14 months of log keeping. He called her when he had something to bring her, when the documentation was sufficient to support a professional assessment and a professional strategy. Patricia's value was not in doing Tyler's documentation for him. Her value was in knowing what to do with documentation that Tyler had built and in executing the legal strategy with the experience and standing that 30 seconds of phone calls and 3 months of building a file do not confer. Find the right professional help at the right time. Not too early when you're spending money before you have a case. Not too late when mistakes have been made that good counsel could have prevented. At the point when you have documentation, a pattern, and a question about what to do next. The fifth lesson is about the specific power of the HOA's own records. The 4-year violation notice history from a management company was the legal backbone of the selective enforcement claim. It was the HOA's own data, produced by the HOA's own management company, that documented the pattern that the case was built on. Francine could not deny the pattern because the pattern was in the records that her own organization maintained. She could argue about interpretation, but she could not argue about the underlying data. Request your community's records. They belong to you. They are produced by an organization that you fund through your dues. Under most state HOA statutes, you have the right to inspect and copy those records. The data in those records may tell you a story that matters, and you cannot know whether it tells that story until you have it in front of you. Francine was not, at her core, a bad person. I want to say this clearly because I think the skeleton incident makes her easy to dismiss as simply ridiculous, and she was not ridiculous. She was a person with real organizational skills and genuine care for the community she lived in, who had allowed the authority of her HOA position to metastasize into something that served her social preferences rather than the community's interests, and who had been doing this for long enough that she had lost the ability to see the distinction. The gatherings at her house were not sinister. They were the normal social life of a person who enjoyed company and music and the specific warmth of late-night conversations with people she liked. The problem was not that she had a social life. The problem was that she had built her governance conduct around it, creating a community within the community where her social circle was exempt from the standards applied to everyone else, and using the mechanisms of institutional authority to enforce that distinction. The skeleton in the street was not evidence of mental illness or substance abuse or any other pathology, though I understand why some people interpreted it that way. The skeleton was evidence of someone who was in the privacy of what she believed was her own unseen experience, a completely different person than the one she presented in her HOA president role. The careful lawns and the perfectly timed holiday decorations and the aggressive enforcement were the public performance. The nightgown and the music and the skeleton were what she actually looked like when she thought nobody was watching. The tragedy is the gap. Not either version of Francine in isolation. The gap between them. The specific kind of psychological compartmentalization that allows a person to be one thing publicly and a completely different thing privately, and to maintain that gap by using institutional authority to control what other people are able to see and know about them. If Francine had run the HOA with the same authenticity that she apparently brought to her Friday night gatherings, she might have been an excellent board president. Someone who understood that the rules existed to enable the community's members to live full and enjoyable lives in their homes, not to perform an aesthetic standard for its own sake. Someone who could have had her music and also let her neighbors have their wind chimes. Someone who could have danced with the skeleton and extended everyone else the same grace. She was not that person. She performed the role, and she performed it at others' expense. The performance eventually could not be sustained. This is the pattern I see in every HOA story we cover. Not the specific facts, which are always different and often extraordinary. The pattern. The gap between the public performance of institutional authority and the private reality of the person performing it. The use of the performance to control what others can see and know. And the eventual moment when the performance is no longer sustainable and the gap closes suddenly and publicly. The skeleton was Francine's gap closing. Tyler happened to be awake. Tyler happened to have his phone. The rest followed. I spoke with Tyler and Priya approximately 1 year after the settlement was finalized. They were in their home, in the kitchen, with Kai, who is now 8, and Nadia, who is now 5, and Scout, who was a fictional character in previous stories, but whose spirit I would like to invoke here as a representative of good and loyal animals everywhere. They were doing well. The legal process had been significantly less exhausting than comparable cases I have covered because Patricia had handled the litigation track efficiently, and because the other side had made the relatively rational decision to settle rather than fight documentation that was comprehensive and well-prepared. The whole process from demand letter to settlement had taken about 4 months, which was fast by HOA dispute standards. The community was in a better place. The new board president was a woman named Sarah who had moved into Maple Creek Commons 2 years earlier and who had been motivated to run for the board specifically by what she had watched happen over the preceding year. The violation notice transparency log had been live for 8 months and showed a dramatically different enforcement pattern than the 4-year history had shown. The comparative rate between social circle members and others had essentially disappeared because everyone was being held to the same standard. Or rather, because the log made it visible if they were not, which was the more accurate description of the mechanism. Tyler had dismantled the noise measurement device after the settlement was finalized. He no longer needed it. He kept the log, not as an active document, but as a record that was filed in the same folder as his violation notice responses and the settlement documentation. He said he doubted he would ever need it again. He said he hoped he was right. I asked him about the night of the skeleton. I asked what it had felt like to watch that scene from his home office window at 2:17 in the morning. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said that what he had felt in the moment, beyond the pure stunned strangeness of it, was something like recognition. Not recognition of Francine specifically, not in the sense of having suspected this specific behavior. Recognition in the sense of suddenly understanding the person he had been dealing with for 2.5 years in a more complete way than he had understood her before. He said that watching someone in their most private and unguarded expression of themselves, even when that expression is strange and unexpected, tells you something true about who they are that their public performance cannot tell you. He had been looking at Francine's performance for 2.5 years. The nightgown and the skeleton were the person underneath the performance. He said he had felt, despite everything, something that was almost compassionate. The performance was clearly exhausting. The gap between who you had to be publicly and who you actually were privately was visibly large. Anyone who needed to wait until 2 in the morning in their nightgown to be themselves had built a very difficult architecture around their daily life. Priya said that was very generous of Tyler and also extremely typical of Tyler, and that the community was lucky Tyler was the one who had kept the log rather than someone who had simply decided from the beginning to destroy Francine rather than document the actual governance issue. Tyler said the governance issue was what mattered. The skeleton was just the skeleton. I thought about this exchange for a long time after I left, about the specific quality of Tyler's response to what he had seen and what he had built. The graphic designer who noticed things and wrote them down. The husband who listened to his wife's advice about finding the right connection. The neighbor who talked to Greg and Melissa and the other people in his community and built a coalition that was genuine rather than recruited. The project manager who delivered the most organized, non-attorney documentation file that a 22-year HOA law veteran had ever received. And the person who watched a woman dance with a skeleton at 2 in the morning and felt something like compassion alongside the recognition. This is what effective HOA advocacy looks like at its best. Not anger, not revenge, not the desire to destroy someone. Documentation, process, professional help, and the specific human quality of understanding that the people on the other side of these disputes are people, with their own complexity and their own gaps and their own private nightgown moments, even when what they have been doing in their institutional role has been genuinely wrong and genuinely harmful. You can acknowledge someone's humanity and still hold them accountable for what they did. You can feel compassion and still file the demand letter. You can watch the skeleton dance and feel something real about the person holding it and still note in your log what you observed and send a timestamp video to your attorney. Tyler did all of these things. The outcome was right. The public violation notice log that the settlement required Maple Creek Commons to implement had been live for 8 months when I visited. It was accessible on the community's website, updated monthly, showing every violation notice issued, the date, the alleged violation, the CC&R provision cited, and the outcome. The homeowner's name and address were replaced with a property ID number for privacy, but the pattern of enforcement was visible to anyone who looked. The log showed something that the 4-year history under Francine had not shown. Consistency. The violation notice rate was lower overall than the historical rate, about 40% lower, which Patricia attributed to the transparency mechanism itself. When enforcement decisions are visible, the decision-maker becomes more careful about making decisions that cannot be justified by specific CC&R citations. The transparency had produced the consistency that the previous system's opacity had prevented. Sarah, the new board president, showed me the log on the community website. She said that she had been asked by several long-term residents whether the lower violation rate meant standards were being enforced less rigorously. She said she had told them that lower rates with specific CC&R citations for each notice meant standards were being enforced more rigorously, not less. More rigorously in the sense that every enforcement action was required to be defensible against the community's own governing documents rather than against the board president's personal assessment of a neighbor's social value. She said that was the whole point, that enforcement was supposed to serve the community standards, not serve the board president's preferences. The log made the distinction visible. I asked her if anyone had raised the skeleton in the year since the meeting. She smiled. She said the skeleton had become a kind of community legend, not a mean way, in the specific way that communities develop shared reference points for moments that revealed something important about their collective experience. When new residents moved in and were introduced to the community's governance structure, the longer-term residents sometimes mentioned the log and explained its history, and someone would eventually say the word skeleton, and then someone else would explain the full story, and the new resident would have the full picture of why the log existed and why it mattered. She said she thought that was actually valuable, that the skeleton story was a kind of community memory that kept the lesson fresh in a way that a governance policy document alone could not. The skeleton, in other words, had become a teaching tool. Tyler would have appreciated the graphic design logic of that. This is the HOA files. And the skeleton story is now my favorite story in 4 years of doing this work. Not because of the image of Francine dancing in the street, though that image is genuinely and perfectly extraordinary. Because of Tyler. Because of the log. Because of the 14 months of observations written down consistently and specifically. Because of Priya's data analysis and Melissa's community knowledge and Patricia's 31 years of experience, all brought to bear on a problem that started with a mailbox post measurement. Because of the specific quality of attention that a visual person who worked from home and who noticed things about his neighborhood brought to a situation that most people would have navigated with frustration and resignation rather than with documentation and professional engagement. Because the skeleton was funny and also true, and also, in the end, the thing that made visible what had been happening in that community for 4 years. And visible things can be addressed. Hidden things cannot. $31,000 was refunded to 14 households. A transparency log exists that makes selective enforcement essentially impossible. An HOA board serves Maple Creek Commons that is accountable to the community rather than to the board president's social calendar. Because someone kept a log. Document everything. Notice what you notice. Write down the date and the time. Let the pattern speak for itself. Find the right professional help at the right moment. And if you happen to see your HOA president dancing with a skeleton at 2 in the morning, save the video. You might need it. This has been the HOA Files. Subscribe for new cases every week. Drop your story in the comments, and I will see you in the next one.